a solution or a problem. Now let me use the rapid rise of the Chinese middle class as an example. Just 15 to 20 years ago, a distinct socio-economic middle class was virtually non-existent in China. But today, there are a sizable number of Chinese citizens who, with private property units, cars, financial assets, and money to spare on travel. One indicator of the middle class' recent growth is the number of credit cards issued. In 2003, 3 million credit cards were issued. By 2008, the number had reached 150 million. Of them, 50 million were issued in 2008. Let me also add that the Chinese don't like to use credit card, or they will pay by the end of the month. They have huge bank savings as well. Now, according to a recent report by McKinsey, by 2025, China's middle class will consist of about 520 million people. Their growing presence will not only stimulate China's domestic demand, but will also contribute to substantial economic growth globally. The rapid growth of Chinese middle class constitutes both challenges and opportunities for China. We in the United States, in my view, should also conceive this trend as both a challenge and an opportunity. Some people in China are now inspired enough to pursue what they call the Chinese dream, an opportunity to lead a middle-class lifestyle. To a great extent, the Chinese dream is inspired by the American dream. As Americans, we should welcome a prosperous and stable China in which 1/5 of the world's population has the opportunity to achieve their own personal dreams. Let me end my remarks by a quote from American writer R. Williamson, who said, I quote, "If the American dream is for Americans only, it will remain our dream and never be our destiny." Thank you very much.
Cards on the table, which are there for your purpose to ask questions, so I hope you'll take some time to fill those out and send them up when we have folks going through the room. So the cards right in the middle of the table with the pencils are for questions. Let me ask one or two opening questions if I can, and get each of your take on it. Ambassador Wu talked about the aspirations of the Chinese people, the global aspirations of the Chinese people. And recently, we've been hearing a lot in Washington about this notion of China and the United States being a collective, not part of a G7, but a G2. Bob Zoellick and Justin Li Fu at the World Bank have called for this, a G2. Zbigniew Brzezinski has called for a G2. Fred Berkston down the street at the Peterson Institute of International Economics has called for a G2. But not many Chinese, other than Justin, seem to be calling for a G2. So maybe we can if I can ask each of you to talk about that. And then the next question is that Cheng talked about the rise of the middle class. Here, when we hear of the rise of a middle class in China, we tend to equate that with the rise of political aspirations for people. And we tend to have a fairly linear approach to the rise of democracy. And you touched on this here in Washington, where we've entered maybe a prolonged episode of one-party democracy. Maybe our experience is not that far from what the Chinese Communist Party will seek to achieve. But maybe I could get your take on that as an issue. And please write your questions.
I have to start. About G2, a few days ago I was in Tokyo. I attended the Trilateral Commission conference. I found a lot of worry from our Japanese colleagues and the European colleagues about G2. So I say at the conference, I think this is a sort of irrational concern about G2. In the eyes of Chinese, what does G2 mean? There are a lot of G3, G4, G7, G8, G20. And G2 is one of them. In the eyes of Chinese, what we like to see is to strengthen U.S.-China cooperation. And as past experience shows, the strengthening U.S.-China cooperation is good news for China, good news for U.S., good news for everybody. So I don't quite understand. I mean, that kind of irrational concern among Japanese and Europeans. Maybe they are afraid of sort of condominium. That China will never seek that, condominium. You know, in 1974, Deng Xiaoping went to the United Nations. I was there. I was working at the Chinese mission to the United Nations. Deng Xiaoping made a very important statement. He said, China is opposed to the hegemony. Should one day China decide to seek hegemony, then I'm calling from this podium people around the world to bring down the Chinese hegemony. So, condominium, maybe China is seeking hegemony. We will not do that. It doesn't mean that we do not attach importance to U.S.-China cooperation. We do. This is the most important relationship in China's foreign policy. I believe if we want our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren to live in peace and prosperity, this relationship matters a lot. So we have to work together to strengthen, to develop this very important cooperation between China and U.S.
Well, the G2 concept, if it's an economic concept, I think certainly it's more reasonable because as Bob Zoellick, the current president of World Bank, said a year ago, this is before the crisis, 40 or 45% of global growth during the past five years really come from these two countries, United States and China. I think probably a better metaphor is these are the United States and China are two engines for the economic development. So I'm perfectly fine with the concept G2. But if we refer to more than economic area, I think most people in the United States, in the Western world, is very uncomfortable, largely because of China's political system. And I agree with Ambassador Wu that there's no universal model for democracy. There's Indian democracy, Mexican democracy, Japanese democracy, British democracy. They're all quite different. But there's a universal value. I think this is no matter which country you live, and should cherish. This is precisely the author of I edited the book, Yu Keping argued, and also Premier Wen Jiabao said repeatedly, China also thinks there's a universal value of a democracy. But the interesting phenomenon is that if you look at China's mainstream media, for example, Xinhua News website, on the left column, Wen Jiabao said there's universal values of democracy, universal value of human rights. On the right column, that other political leaders saying that China will never adopt the Western political system. Now, this really linked to the question Charles asked me about China's political system, the dynamics I referred to, but I never got a chance to elaborate. Yes, China is a one-party system, but it does not mean that the Chinese leadership is a monolithic group. Leaders differ in terms of worldviews, values, and policy orientations. I actually characterize Chinese leadership or Chinese political system as a one-party, two factions. It's borrowing Deng Xiaoping's one country, two systems. On the one hand, there's what I call elitist faction or coalition, represents interests of entrepreneurs, middle class, and the so-called sea turtles, returnees, foreign educated returnees. And most of them live in the coast area, or we may call the coast region China's blue states. The other is the populist coalition or populist faction, largely led by Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, represents the interests of farmers, migrant workers, urban poor. They usually have their power base in inland China, or we call China's red states. Now, this is these two factions